Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our community session on understanding the environmental effects statement process. My name is Lauren. I'm the Major Developments Community Engagement Officer at Moorabool Shire Council, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional lands on which we are broadcasting today and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Due to current restrictions, we must run this session virtually from our own homes, so please excuse any technical difficulties that may occur. And while we may have to be physically apart and virtually connected right now, our hope is that this session will help us connect as a community and provide you with some valuable information with regards to the Western Victoria Transmission Network project. The format of tonight's session will begin with a presentation by our expert guest, Jack Krohn, that addresses many of the questions that we've received from the community in the lead up to the session. After that, we'll have the opportunity for live Q&A with those of you who are tuned in. Your microphones are muted at the moment, but you can submit your questions via the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'll try to get through as many of them as possible in the time that we have. Alrighty, so let's get to it. I'm delighted to welcome Jack Krohn, Senior Impact Assessor at the Department of Land, Water and Planning.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you everybody for the opportunity. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of all the lands across which we're meeting tonight. In my own case, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging of all those peoples and elders of any other communities who may be participating tonight. I hope that tonight's event will just help to clarify for people what the requirement for an environment effects statement, an EES, for the Western Victoria Transmission Network project means, and how you can all make the most of the opportunities to participate in the process. If we could go to the next one, please, Lauren. So just to put a bit of context, environmental impact assessment's been around for just over 50 years. The first legislation was in the United States. Australian legislation happened in 1974 at a national level and in Victoria a few years later, and we're still operating under the Environment Effects Act of 1978. The global discipline works at all different levels around the world. Countries have impact assessment legislation, states, provinces, regions. So it's very broadly adopted as a process with a primary objective of better informed decision making. And that includes decisions in the sense of statutory decisions, decisions about whether to grant approvals, whether to apply conditions to approvals, but also decisions by proponents about the shape in which they might wish to take their projects forward. What we're dealing with here and what we're dealing with when we talk about environmental impact assessment, we talk about project environmental impact assessment. So it's about the potential effects of a project. And if you look at the Environment Effects Act, it talks about the effects of works, which is, you know, very much the physical nature of developing a project. If we could go on, please, to the next one. So again, at that global level, there are some standard principles. Environmental impact assessment has a technical dimension, so it's about assembling and analysing information, and it also has a procedural dimension about making sure that the right parties are involved in the process, and in particular public participation, which is integral to impact assessment. It works in different ways in different jurisdictions, but if something is calling itself environmental impact assessment, it has a public participation dimension. Environmental impact assessment looks at alternatives. That's an important component, and it's something that, because environmental impact assessment can start at an earlier phase of a project being considered than what you're at when you're looking at actually approvals applications, it's possible to use the environmental assessment process to inform the consideration of those alternatives. It's also an integrated process, and by that I mean there are often a number, perhaps even a dozen or more different areas of technical specialty that are investigated through environmental assessment. It's important that even though you have specialists who look at each of those areas, that the results of their work are brought together and integrated and not just sort of siloed. Impact assessment also looks at mitigation. So it identifies what impacts might occur if a project goes ahead, and it looks at ways in which those impacts can be reduced or managed so that they achieve a threshold of acceptability. I guess there's an implicit assumption that projects which are subject to environmental impact assessment may ultimately have a degree of impact, and that we accept that to some extent. Impacts can be acceptable if, on balance, the project in question delivers a benefit. What we're looking at is the level of acceptability of those impacts. In the process, there is a proponent, the party, the person, the organisation which has come up with the proposed project, and they are routinely responsible for preparing a statement that explains the project and the work that they've done in investigating its environmental impacts. And there is also an authority. In the Victorian case, it's the Minister for Planning, who makes an assessment as the final product of the environmental impact assessment process. And that takes into account what the proponent has had to say in its statement and the views of stakeholders expressed through the public participation phase. So if we could move on to the next one, please. So there is a common sequence, and it's the way each phase in the sequence is done might vary from one jurisdiction to another, but basically they all include these steps. So the first one, referral, is working out what project, a process by which you sort of filter out the projects that might be subject to impact assessment. Screening is the jargon term that we use for the decision about whether a project that has been referred will be subject to impact assessment. Then there's scoping, working out what the impact assessment should cover. The longest step, usually in time terms, is preparation of the statement, and that's work that the proponent is required to do, taking into account the scope, taking into account inputs from regulators and stakeholders, and the time that it takes is often a function of the complexity of the studies that may have to be carried out, seasonal aspects and so forth. Then the review phase is when the statement is published for public comment. The assessment stage is where the authority reaches its advice to the proponent and to decision makers in the form of a formal assessment, and then the decisions that are required to be made, especially by statutory authorities about approvals, are made informed by that assessment. So we'll move on to the next one. So in Victoria, our Environment Effects Act talks about proposed works, so essentially projects capable of having a significant effect on the environment. And significant is one of those, I guess, judgmental or subjective terms as to where significance lies. But we have, although the Environment Effects Act is very brief and doesn't go into a great deal of detail about process, We have a document called Ministerial Guidelines under the Act, which is there and which is downloadable from our website. The guidelines set out most of the detail about how we go about the process. They include a definition of environment, which is essentially everything to do with human surroundings for the purposes of an EES. So it doesn't just include what you might call the biophysical environment, the wildlife and the water and so forth, but it also includes potential social impacts, landscape impacts, noise, economic impacts as well. So it's quite a broad interpretation of environment. And significance is set out also in the criteria that, or it's explained in the guidelines in the criteria that apply to what sorts of projects might require referral and the sorts of projects that ultimately might be subject to an environment effects statement. We also have an established bilateral agreement between the Victorian government and the Australian government for the assessment purposes of the Commonwealth environmental assessment legislation, which is the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which has received a bit of publicity recently because it's been going through a review process. So that bilateral agreement has been in place for quite some years in relation to the assessment purposes of that Act. The approvals powers under that Act still remain with the Commonwealth. And in this case, as in many cases of EESs, the project in question is what the EPBC Act calls a controlled action, meaning that it requires assessment and approval under that Act, and the Victorian EES will serve as the assessment process for those purposes of the EPBC Act. So if we go to the next one, please. Here's the sequence. Referral, decision. We are currently sitting in between the decision phase and the scoping phase. Important to understand that the EES process is an assessment process. It doesn't lead of itself to an approval. The project will be subject to the approvals that it would have been subject to in the absence of an EES anyway, but the decisions about those approvals have to await the Minister's assessment before they're allowed to be made. So we'll move on to the next one. And so this in a sense is similar to the previous one, but it's talking about in the specific context of the Victorian process when the opportunities for public participation happen. So there's essentially 3 stages of the process where the Minister or the Department on behalf of the Minister will offer the opportunity for public comments. The first is when the scoping requirements are advertised. At this stage for Western Victoria Transmission Network project, we anticipate that that will be in a month or two's time. So that's the scoping requirements are a document usually around 25 or 30 pages long that essentially sets out the expected coverage of the studies for the EES. Then after the EES has been prepared, and this is a process that can take always at least several months and commonly more than a year, but when the EES has been completed and it is placed, as we say, on public exhibition, it's advertised for comment. In the case of Western Victoria Transmission Network project, that will be a 6-week public comment period, and that is I guess the primary opportunity for people to express their views about the project as it's presented in the EES for the consideration of the Minister. Those submissions will be referred to an independent inquiry, which the Minister will appoint, and it will hold public hearings. And that's the next opportunity for direct participation. But the only thing I would stress there is that you need to have made a written submission in response to exhibition of the EES So that second public opportunity on the slide, if you've made a written submission, then you will be offered the opportunity to be heard at the inquiry. If you choose not to be heard, your written submission will still be considered and it will be given weight. And the hearings are always conducted in a public format, so even if you don't wish to be heard, you are able to sit and listen to what everybody else has to say. If we could move on to the next one, please, which looks very similar, but this is about the proponent's responsibilities. So under the Environment Effects Act and the ministerial guidelines, responsibility for engagement with the public is also placed on the proponent. So the proponent's expected to carry out formal engagement under an EES consultation plan that they must prepare, and that will be published on the DELP website when it is when we're satisfied with it. And that will set out the way in which they propose to carry out their engagement during the period when the EES is in preparation, which, as I said, is likely to be upwards of a year. So it's quite a long part of the process, and it's part where that consultation with the community can be really important in identifying issues, identifying matters of local concern, especially with a project with such a large geographical footprint as this one, and making sure that all of the information that needs to be taken into account is drawn forward. The proponents will commonly also conduct some engagement activities during the exhibition phase of the EES to make it a little bit easier for people to get their heads around what can be quite a large and complicated package of documentation, so that people are as well informed as possible in putting their submissions together. So that the form of engagement that is going to be described in an EES consultation plan will vary from one project to another. What might be appropriate, say, for the Melbourne Metro Rail Tunnel project that was an EES about a railway tunnel running under the Melbourne CBD, might not be appropriate, say, for a mineral sand mine in the Wimmera, or a highway bypass of a country town, or a project such as the Western Vic Transmission Project. So we expect proponents to put some serious thought and expertise into the form of engagement that they propose to carry out, and then execute that engagement effectively. We also expect that the consultation plan will be something of a living document, that it will be reviewed and updated as the need may arise, as new information comes to hand, or as the shape of the project perhaps changes, or indeed circumstances such as pandemics change the conditions under which the engagement's being carried out. So we move on to the next one, please. So the scoping phase, which is the next phase to happen in this project, the draft scoping requirements will be advertised after involvement from the proponent and the agencies through our technical reference group. So that work will happen over the next few weeks, and then they'll be advertised for comment. The scoping requirements are not exclusive. The proponent is expected to cover off on everything that may need to be managed, and if new issues emerge after the scoping requirements have been put together, that doesn't excuse a proponent from needing to investigate and deal with those. However, we also expect that proponents will take what is called a risk-based approach to their investigation of issues identified in the scoping requirements, as we will do in developing the scoping requirements, so that the level of effort that is put into investigation is proportionate to the level of environmental risk or potential impact that different issues may have. And again, this will vary quite a lot from one project to another. The important thing with the scoping requirements, I guess, is that they won't be prescriptive about how studies are to be carried out. They won't preempt potential findings of studies. The onus will remain on the proponent to prepare an adequate EES, but the scoping requirements will be important for us in briefing the Minister when the proponent believes that the EES is ready for exhibition. We will go back to the scoping requirements, and in some sense they will serve as a benchmark for determining whether what the proponent has done is adequate to take out to the community. If we could go to the next one, please. In preparing an EES, the proponent will develop what we call a study program, and the study program is the proponent's take on what they think they will need to do in the context of the nature of the project and the assessment process. That's useful information for us in terms of understanding what the scoping requirements might need to cover, but if we feel, or the Minister feels, that there are things that are not addressed in the study program, then they can still be put into the scoping requirements. The technical reference group is a standard part of our process. We will set that up and it will meet periodically while the EES is in preparation, providing advice both to ourselves and to the proponent relevant to the preparation of the EES. That will include technical review of draft studies, but it will also include things like aligning statutory approvals procedures with the EES process, so that as far as possible the process is run in a fully coordinated and integrated way, and make it easier for people who wish to make submissions to make a submission about the project without worrying about whether the bit of the project that they wish to talk about is covered in the EES or is perhaps to do with the planning approval or some other approval. So we'll keep it as simple as possible in a procedural sense. If we could go to the next one, please. So the public review will happen once the Minister is satisfied that the EES is adequate for the public to comment upon. That judgment by the Minister that it's adequate to go to exhibition is not in any sense an endorsement of any arguments that are presented in the EES or in any way an endorsement of the project. It is simply saying that the EES is adequate as a body of information for the public to consider and comment upon. The written submissions are treated as public documents and they will be published on the internet once they have been registered. If there are statutory approvals that have a public comment phase of their own that are relevant to the project, then they will be coordinated with the EES as closely as we can. The actual approvals that a project needs vary according to the nature of the project, and the public participation opportunities in those approvals processes also vary. So that's part of our role working with TRG to make sure that we align those things as correctly and closely as possible. The Act says that the Minister may appoint an inquiry. In practice, the Minister has always appointed an inquiry for many years now, and the inquiry is set up through Planning Panels Victoria, which is a unit within DELP. And the Minister has also said that this inquiry will be conducted by a formal hearing, which means that everybody who makes a written submission will have the opportunity to speak to that submission in front of the inquiry. The inquiry will then consider all the information that it's been given, the exhibited EES, the written submissions, the proponent's response to submissions, and all the material that is presented at the hearing, and will prepare a report which will assist the Minister in making the Minister's assessment. And the Minister's assessment is then published, as is the report of the inquiry. And if you want to have a look at what those things look like, there are a number of them published on the DELP internet for projects which have been through the process and the process has concluded. So you can have a look at ministers' assessments and you can have a look at inquiry reports and get a sense of how those documents take shape. If we could go on to the next one, please. So the assessment is the end of the EES process. It's the authoritative advice that the minister gives to the proponent and to the statutory decision makers about whether the likely environmental effects of the project are acceptable and if modifications may be required or particular conditions or controls may be required. Under the guidelines, the minister normally provides his assessment within 25 business days of receiving the inquiry's report. That can be challenging at times, but that's our target timeline. And decision makers under Victorian law are required to consider the minister's assessment. And if there are time limits within their own legislation about dealing with approvals applications under the Environment Effects Act, they have a month after receiving the minister's assessment. And as I said, because this is an accredited assessment process under the EPBC Act, the Victorian Minister's assessment will be delivered to the Commonwealth Minister to inform the Commonwealth decision as to whether to grant approval under the EPBC Act. One slide to go. And this is very much just a quick summary of what I've been trying to cover. So the environmental impact assessment process is a global process. It's practiced all around the world, and the EES process is the Victorian version of how that is conducted here. We have all our procedural information is set out in the ministerial guidelines. For every EES, there are scoping requirements that set that project-specific scope in the context of the ministerial guidelines. The process, and this is perhaps a point I should really make, it's not uncommon for people to interpret the EES as being synonymous with the EES process, but the EES is a component of the process. It's the component that the proponent is required to prepare, but the process comprises not only the EES, but the input from the public, drawn together by the inquiry and the report of the inquiry, which then informs the minister's assessment. So all of those components are important and critical to the EES process. And at the end of that, after the minister has made the minister's assessment, the decision makers must consider the assessment in making their informed decisions. So that's as much as I need to say, I think, in terms of the formal presentation, and I'm happy to take the questions that have come in.
Thank you so much for that, Jack. So yeah, we'll now move on to our question and answer session. So please feel free to type in your questions in the question box on your screen. We have received a few already. So one of the questions that have come from several people is, is it possible to have more than 15 business days to review and provide input to the EES scope?
The 15 business days is the standard time that's provided under the ministerial guidelines, and it's what the minister has indicated will apply in this case in his procedures and requirements. The scoping requirements is not a long document. As I said, it's usually about 25 to 30 pages. Again, you can have a look on our website and you will be able to look at scoping requirements for a number of EESs that are in progress at the moment, which will give you an idea of the sort of scale of the task of looking at the scoping requirements. I suppose the other thing I should just stress is that the scoping requirements phase is not an opportunity. It's not intended to be an opportunity for people to express a view about the merits or otherwise of the project. It's very much about what are the things that the EES needs to cover in order to lead to that potential for well-informed decision making. So at this stage, I would expect that we would be working to that 15 business days.
Right, thank you. And another question is, does the process only consider alternatives proposed by the proponent, or can they come through public participation and the specialists themselves?
So the nature of alternatives can be is very much a function of the nature of the project. So for some projects, there are alternatives, as in this case, in respect of things like alignments. So quite a number of EESs are done on what we refer to as linear infrastructure, and an important aspect of the alternatives, whether you're looking at a railway line or a road or a pipeline or a transmission line, is the actual route that it's going to follow. Oftentimes you've got a pretty fair idea of what the endpoints need to be, but there may be some flexibility around the route. But there are other forms of alternatives as well. Like there can be alternatives that relate to the staging of projects, to the design of projects. So there's quite a range of things that can emerge as potential alternatives. The critical thing for us in terms of alternatives is that they need to be feasible in the context of what the project objectives are, and they need to have a reasonable scope for delivering a comparable or better environmental outcome. So that's the sort of purpose of alternatives in the context of the EES process. It's really about how will these possible alternatives help to deliver a better environmental outcome. And oftentimes the alternatives that come up they all have impacts and they all have potential benefits, and it can be a bit of an apples and oranges comparison. So at the scoping requirements, we'll usually talk about alternatives, but in the final analysis, there is an onus on the proponent to be able to demonstrate that they have adequately considered the alternatives that are viable and feasible in the context of the project, and that they have adequately investigated both the impacts and the environmental benefits associated with those alternatives.
Thank you, Jack. Jim would like to know if you could please elaborate on how the technical reference group is appointed.
Okay, so the technical reference group is an advisory body that the department establishes for the purposes of making sure that all of the authorities which either have statutory decision-making powers or which have technical expertise in relevant areas are brought together and help to inform the development of the scoping requirements or the draft scoping requirements, and provide a review mechanism for the work that the proponent and the proponent's consultants will do in terms of environmental investigations. So it's if you like, it's the authorities aspect of the stakeholder engagement. All the sort of non-authority stakeholder engagement is very much the responsibility of the proponent. An important part of the TRG process is also about making sure that all the procedural requirements associated with the statutory approvals processes are properly understood, and that we can make sure that those are correctly aligned. The TRG is there to provide advice to the department and advice to the proponent, but it doesn't in any sense act as a decision-making forum. It's not executive, it's not directive, it's very much about just trying to make sure that the information which ultimately appears in the exhibited EES has been technically reviewed and from a technical point of view is sound.
Thank you, Jack. Anonymous has asked, have there been examples where the scoping completely changes as a consequence of EES? For example, overhead to underground.
Yeah, there's certainly been cases where the shape of a project has changed from what the proponent initially described in the referral, and some of this even goes back to, you know, before when we had formal referrals as a way of triggering EESs. There was a project many years ago for a sewerage scheme where at the outset of the EES process, the expectation was that the project would take the form of a local treatment plant, and as a consequence of the EES investigations, the shape of that project changed essentially to an export pipeline to carry the sewage to an existing treatment plant located elsewhere. So that was quite at the end of the day, the objective of delivering a sewerage service to those communities was still achieved, but it was achieved in a very different way from what had been thought at the start. And that, I guess, is an illustration of a proponent taking on board environmental information that emerged out of the EES process and configuring the project accordingly. There is also scope for the Minister's assessment ultimately to conclude that aspects of a project need to change in order for the project to achieve acceptable impacts. And there have been a number of occasions where a Minister's assessment has recommended quite substantial changes to the form of a project. So it's all going to boil down to those environmental investigations and to some extent to the views of parties, but certainly alternatives is going to be part of that consideration, and it's our expectation in the case of every EES that proponents will take on board what emerges out of those studies in making their own decisions about the form in which they wish to carry the project forward.
Thank you, Jack. We had a question from Jill who sent in something prior to the session. She wanted to know if historically do unacceptable EES assessments actually result in projects either not progressing or requiring major changes?
Short answer is yes. There have been a number of assessments, certainly over the last 30 years. There have been several EESs which have finished up with a Minister's assessment saying that the environmental effects would be unacceptable, and those projects have not proceeded. It is, if we get to that point, it would be open to a proponent to try and come up with a way of reconfiguring the project to respond to whatever had underpinned the Minister's assessment concluding that the environmental effects would be unacceptable. But I guess we would also hope that if those sorts of options are available, that proponents would be picking up on that as the environmental studies proceed. But certainly, even though the Minister's assessment is a package of advice, it's not a decision in its own right, but the decision makers to whom those Minister's assessments have been given have not granted the approvals for those projects.
Anonymous has asked in relation to that, can the Minister's decision be overridden by federal government?
So I really want to stress that what the Minister for Planning does at the end of the EES process is make an assessment. He's not making a decision. The assessment is a package of advice, and in the same way that that assessment is advice to decision makers under Victorian law, it is also advice to the Commonwealth Minister for the Environment in the case of an EES which is performing that accredited assessment function. So It is open to the Federal Minister to receive the Minister's assessment and choose to make a decision which is different from that assessment, but I'm not aware of that having happened over the 7 or 8 or more years that we've had the bilateral agreement in place. So I don't expect that would happen.
Thank you. Another anonymous has asked, has the Minister revealed if he is in favour of the project or against it?
Minister, well, I cannot speak for the Minister. However, the normal approach by the Minister over all of the years and all of the ministers I've worked under, once the Minister decides that an EES is required, is to allow the process to run to its conclusion and then form a view at the stage of formulating the Minister's assessment. So I don't anticipate that the Minister will have a view in favour of the project or against the project until such time as all the information is available and the Minister is in a position to make the Minister's assessment.
Thank you, Jack. We received a question from Margaret prior to this session, which was in relation to the Central Goldfields region. She asks, how does the EES investigation assess the impact of these towers on the bid for World Heritage recognition, as well as the effect on the cultural and heritage values of the Central Goldfields?
So in sort of turning it around the other way, the cultural and heritage values that could be impacted by a project are absolutely within the definition of environment as far as the Environment Effects Act process is concerned. So that's certainly something that we would expect to be investigated through the EES studies. If there is a designated value such as World Heritage or National Heritage or sites registered on the Victorian Heritage Register, then that becomes part of the consideration and may also create specific heritage-related approvals requirements. However, if there's something like a World Heritage nomination in progress, that's not the same as as a World Heritage listing having been put in place. But the values that might be reflected in the notion of preparing that nomination would still need to be considered in their own right.
Thank you, Jack. One question from Claire is, given the large agricultural and productivity implications for this project, why were no agricultural related parties or relevant decision makers notified of this process by the Minister?
I'm not sure which authorities might be meant. The notice that the Minister gives, the formal notice that the Minister gives, is basically in relation to those decision-making responsibilities, and it's about ensuring that statutory decisions, especially statutory approvals decisions, are not made before the Minister's assessment is considered. Certainly where there may be agricultural values involved, then we would expect proponents to liaise with agricultural bodies within government and reflect the outcomes of those consultations in their studies. And we certainly expect that where agricultural values are part of the environment for the purposes of a project, that will be one of the areas of investigation. And that would be the case for this project as well. But the specific notice is very much about those formal approvals decisions and making sure that they are not made prematurely.
Thanks, Jack. Has an EES been conducted in recent years relating to power distribution or transmission lines. Can you refer our listeners to anything similar?
My understanding is that this is the largest scale transmission line project in Victoria for many years. There was certainly environmental assessment done on the Basslink project, which was an electricity connection project between Tasmania and Victoria, maybe 15 or 20 years ago. There have been EESs for a number of wind farm projects, and at least one of those involved an export transmission line, but the EES requirement was fundamentally about the wind farm. So it's we haven't had a lot of EESs for electricity transmission infrastructure in recent years, but it's also not uncommon for us to have an EES required for a type of project which has some novelty or some elements to it that are we haven't got a lot of operational background with.
Thanks, Jack. There seems to be a lot of questions coming through about the onus on the proponent to present the EES and going through them going through the appropriate analysis of different aspects. How is this regulated to ensure proper process has been implemented?
Yeah, so it is standard around the world for the proponent to have the responsibility for preparing the statement. A big part of the oversight of that is the technical reference group. So the technical reference group will have representation from the government authorities, including agencies and including local government, who have technical expertise in the areas that the EES will need to investigate. So that's one way of trying to make sure that the work which is done by the proponent or the proponent's consultants is done to an appropriate standard and is technically sound in the way that it's carried out. There is also, I guess, the professional obligation on the consultants who are involved in that work to carry out that work to a professional standard. Now, there's not always only one way of doing work of that nature, and the onus will be on the proponent and the proponent's consultants to demonstrate that the methodologies that they have chosen are appropriate to the circumstances. But the TRG is an important part of that review process. Under the ministerial guidelines, there is also the option for what is called peer review to be commissioned. So it's where essentially a quite separate consultant is given the job of reviewing the technical work that's been done by the consultant appointed by the proponent. That's quite commonly done in EES world, especially for disciplines that have modelling as a key part of their assessment methodology, or are in very technical areas, especially where the potential impacts are not things that are readily able to be seen or tangible. So things like groundwater, for instance, are commonly subject to peer review. Now, peer review is not superior review. It's review by another consultant of comparable competence and speciality in the field. But if that review helps to give a little bit more confidence that the proponent's primary consultant has done things in accordance with the expectations relevant to that industry or that discipline, then that helps to give a little bit more confidence in the findings of those studies.
Thank you, Jack. We have a quite a question from Stephen, which has a number of different elements to it. So I'll read it all out to you and just let me know if you want me to repeat any of parts of it.
Okay.
Yep. Why would AusNet not undertake an EES across the thousands of properties within the entire area of interest, or at least a broader set as opposed to a straight corridor? What is the value of undertaking the EES with only 20 to 30 properties? Surely this will not provide a suitable data set and therefore will be an inferior result. What should we do to best demonstrate the environmental value of our land? What should we be documenting? And how do I ensure only those directly engaged under the EES process are entering my land? For example, do I make them sign in each time they come to my property? And can I, as a landholder, choose who undertakes the EES and have AusNet pay?
Okay, it is a long and complicated question. So the decision that the Minister made to require an EES was made on the basis of AusNet's referral, which set out what was described as an area of interest, which varies from a few kilometres wide towards the western end near Bulgana to some tens of kilometres wide around to the north of Ballarat, and quite wide again approaching the eastern end of the project at Sydenham. We will expect that over the course of the EES, or the preparation of the EES, that AusNet undertakes adequate studies and investigations to inform the refinement of a corridor or corridors, and ultimately a preferred alignment within that area of interest. I can't comment on any particular number of properties because I haven't seen anything of that nature from AusNet to this point, but ultimately the work that AusNet does in preparing the EES will have to provide an adequate response to the scoping requirements, and the scoping requirements will be framed in the context of the project as described in the referral. As far as the environmental value of, or people demonstrating the environmental value of their land, as I said, environment is very, very broad, and it may be that certain parts of the area of interest will have high biodiversity values, other parts will have high heritage values, other parts will have high landscape values, and so on. If you're aware of particular values on your land, it's important that they be brought forward into the process. One way of doing that is by informing the proponent so that the proponent can factor that into their investigations. Another way is by informing authorities that may have relevant interests. So whether that's your local government authority, whether that's the department through a regional office, whether it's Heritage Victoria, those are all options. The EES studies are carried out by consultants appointed by the proponent. It is not possible for anybody else to determine who carries out those studies. That is absolutely the responsibility of the proponent to do that work. As far as access to property for investigations, I guess my advice would be that the purpose of the EES process is to enable well-informed decision making. If there are, so to speak, holes in the information that comprises the EES because the proponent has not been able to get access to parts of the area for environmental studies, that's not going to help get the best informed decisions at the end of the process. As far as working out whether you're satisfied that the people who are seeking to come onto your property are appropriately appointed by the proponent, that would be something probably to take up with the proponent as to whether it gives letters of authority to its specialists, whether they make prior contact with you before seeking to come onto the property to do whatever field work they may need to do. That would be something to engage directly with the proponent about, to make sure that you're comfortable that whoever is coming onto the property for EES purposes is appropriately authorised for that work.
Thank you, Jack. I think you managed to tick off everything in that question, so that's great. A couple questions regarding the technical reference group again. Can you tell us who is on the reference group, and if AEMO, for example, if they will be part of the reference group, or you know, authorities regarding bushfire risk, will they be a part of it?
So we've issued invitations, and I think we've got responses from almost all of the organisations, but I know that there were, when I last looked today, there were still a couple we were waiting on. So I can't be definitive about which ones have nominated representatives. Fire is certainly one of the areas where we've sought to have representation. Energy Safe Victoria is another that has been invited to be part of the TRG. AEMO is an interesting question, and I don't have a direct answer for that, but we would certainly want to be maintaining contact with AEMO through the preparation phase of the EES, even if they're not formally part of the TRG. In the same way, the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, which is the Commonwealth Department responsible for administering the EPBC Act, they're normally not formally part of the TRG, but we directly engage with them over the course of the process to make sure that what is being done in the context of the EES is going to be adequate for informing the decision that they have to make at the end. And certainly if we find, as the EES process progresses, that there's a rationale for adding an organisation to the TRG, then that's open to us to do.
Thank you, Jack. One question that I think a lot of people are wondering is, what is the true power of the community voice in this process? Or is it just a nice to have box ticking exercise? That is, how much energy should the community expend on a process that they appear not to have that much power over?
From a process point of view, public participation is absolutely integral to environmental impact assessment, and we very strongly encourage people who have views about the environmental dimensions of a project that's subject to an EES to take advantage of the opportunities to participate in that. It is not uncommon for a project that goes through an EES to take shape differently to a greater or lesser extent at the conclusion of the project from the shape that it was in when the process began. As I said, sometimes that is because a proponent makes changes in response to information that emerges from the EES. In a number of cases, including the present case, we've had a proponent refer a project with a fair degree of flexibility about alignment, so that essentially the project is still at a relatively early stage of design when the referral happens, and the EES process is going to be part of informing the decisions that the proponent has to make about its preferred alignment. We've got an EES that's recently come off exhibition for the Crib Point gas project in Western Port, where there have been some thousands of submissions. And that certainly is expressive of a level of community view. But I think the thing that the inquiry has stressed in that case, and other inquiries have stressed also, is that the important thing is not the number of people who are saying something, but the weight and the validity of what they are saying. And if there are views or information or perspectives to be brought forward from the community that that are valid to the consideration of the environmental effects of a project, then it's absolutely important for those to be in the mix, and they will be given the due weight that they deserve.
Thank you, Jack. We'll have to wrap it up there just due to time. But thank you all for all the many questions that you've been sending through. Thank you, Jack, for joining us and for sharing your expertise and time with us. A recording of this session will be made available on our website in the coming days. And we also have another community session scheduled for Thursday, 8th of October, on the topic of understanding compulsory land acquisition and compensation. The details are on our website, and we'll be sending out a follow-up email following this session with all of the details. If you have any feedback or questions or recommendations that you'd like us to address in future sessions, please send them through. We really appreciate all of your feedback. So thank you again for joining us, and we really hope you found it to be a very valuable evening, and we hope to see you next time. Thanks very much.
Thank you.